Everything looks okay?
Yeah.
Hello, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Monique Clark, and I'll be moderating this session. I'm glad to welcome Andrew Barber, Alexis Juarez, and Michelle Ashley Gohr from Arizona State University. They will be presenting the student worker experience, curating a culture of inclusivity. Before we get started, let's go over a few housekeeping items. This session is being recorded and will be available for later viewing after the conference. Please use the Q&A feature for any presentation-related questions. You can also use the Q&A to submit anonymous questions. There will be 10 to 15 minutes for the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Please use the chat for general comments or technical issues. Rebecca will be monitoring the chat for any questions and comments. Last but not least, please abide by the code of conduct, which can be found here. And now I will turn things over to our guests, Andrew Barber, Alexis Juarez, and Michelle Ashley Gohr.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your time today. So as was just announced, we are going to be talking about the student worker experience, about research that we've recently done at Arizona State University at the beginning of the pandemic with some of our students, and how they feel about their place in the workplace and the work that they do. But before we begin, if you've been lucky enough to ever fly into the Phoenix Valley, you've likely seen the Salt River Project canals that surround the area. So what's really interesting about these canals is that the modern day canals actually follow the framework of those canals originally constructed by the ancestral Sonoran Desert people, the Huhugan, in order to make the area both livable and a place that people could thrive. And so because today we're presenting from Arizona State University, which is distributed throughout the valley, the largest campus being in Tempe, we'd like to acknowledge that the modern day indigenous nations, such as the Akimel, Otham, and Creeposh people, are descended from these ancestral peoples that originally inhabited the land, as mentioned before, the Huhugan. So us as presenters, we're dedicated to learning more about the indigenous peoples on whose land we occupy, and also the history of colonization and current movements to restore justice and equity to the original inhabitants of this land. And in case any of you are interested in learning more about the greater Phoenix area and its history, I've put a link in the chat right now. This is a really amazing read. I highly recommend reading up on it if you want to learn more. Next slide. All right, so before we go on, we're going to introduce ourselves really quickly, talk about the table of contents, so what we'll be discussing today. My name is Michelle Ashley Gohr. My pronouns are they and she. I'm a first-year experience and outreach librarian at Arizona State University.
Hey everyone, sorry, I was trying to copy a link over and accidentally sent you to our projects. Don't click that link. My name is Andrew Barber. I'm a student shift supervisor at the downtown Phoenix campus at Arizona State University. And I'm a current MLIS graduate student at the University of Arizona. And I'm set to graduate in May, so I'm almost done.
Hi everyone, I'm Alexis Juarez. I am a former student ambassador with the ASU Library and a recent graduate. I graduated in fall of 2020 with a degree in urban planning and minors in global and design studies. I'm currently a library assistant with the College Depot at the Phoenix Public Library.
And Alexis also has plans to be a librarian in the future. Yay, Alexis! All right, so this is a little bit of what we're going to be discussing today. We're going to start with some background and set context for what Arizona looks like in terms of our labor laws and what laws apply to student workers in terms of minimum wage, sick time accrual, et cetera, because all of that context is really important to their experience in the pandemic. And then next we'll be talking about the study that we conducted over the summer and follow that up with the results that we got from that study, And then finally go over some interventions and suggestions from students who we talked to, and then finish it off with some suggested readings that we thought were really crucial to our understanding of not only shock doctrines usually employed during pandemics, but also how we as staff members can be aware of a lot of the issues of justice that are occurring in our workplaces and how we can support and uplift student workers. All right, so we're going to start off with a little bit of background. So every state is unique in terms of their labor laws. Arizona is a right to work state, which impacts not just staff, but also student workers and temporary workers as well. The most important thing we want to highlight is that in 2016, the Arizona House and Senate passed Prop 206, which was meant to gradually increase the minimum wage to $12 by 2020. And then tie it to further increases in the standard of living. However, some of the wording in this proposition was a little ambiguous. So it did provide an exemption for temporary workers. And what a temporary worker was generally left up to interpretation. And in this sense, it included student workers. So this does not require compliance with minimum wage offered with or items approved in the proposition, such as paid sick time or accrual of vacation for temporary employees. So at the time of this study, only one of Arizona's 3 public universities had willingly adjusted the student employee pay to meet minimum wage equal to state law, and that was the University of Arizona. So students were still making well below minimum wage in some cases. And although I'm going to mention HB 2523, this did not pass, but it does give us an example of not just some legislation that is circulating in Arizona, but this is happening across the country. This was a bill that was sponsored by the Goldwater Institute, and it allowed businesses to pay less than the state minimum wage to workers under the age of 22 if they're enrolled as full-time students, fewer than 20 hours a week. Like I said, this does not pass, but this still goes to show that there is a very antagonistic environment in Arizona in particular when it comes to students or part-time employees. And that's really crucial if we're going to be discussing how mental health and well-being and wages are going to be impacted for students. Okay, next slide. So this is just an example of article in the state press. So the state press is primarily like an ASU type area newspaper that's fairly well read, talking about on-campus workers exemption from Prop 206. And it had some really heartbreaking interviews with a lot of students. I'll share the link in a minute, but it featured a lot of stories from student workers discussing whether or not they thought the proposition was good and whether they thought it would impact them. I highly recommend reading it. It does offer a lot of good insight into what our students are thinking and going through. So before we begin and go into our study, like we added context with labor laws in Arizona, it's also important to add context in terms of the global economy and social conditions under which not only we ourselves as staff and professionals are laboring, but also student workers or paraprofessionals, as they're often called. So many of the issues discussed here, as well as our concerns, existed long before the pandemic even began. We think it's erroneous to assume that these issues are just being faced by students during the pandemic, that they are new and unique, because they are not. A lot of what the students are experiencing now and what we ourselves are experiencing now as well are actually intentional choices on the part of businesses and corporations and governments that have been made over decades. So pre-pandemic labor issues leading up to the pandemic were then exacerbated once everything started occurring, and it was just made evident through the pandemic. So one of the issues we're going to discuss a little bit is the issue of hierarchy and structure. So students are the lowest in the workplace hierarchy. And undoubtedly, a lot of you, we have quite a few attendees here, have probably experienced a restructuring in their library or their workplace in recent years. And this restructuring and the language of restructuring is often used to mask, distort, or reframe profit-driven practices of neoliberalism and the decisions made to positively benefit library employees and the missions of the library. However, this manifests in various ways, including increasing reliance on low wage, unpaid, and temporary workers, a focus on productivity disguised as an administrative concern for worker wellness. So think of wellness breaks or wellness apps, or a lot of our administrations or universities or community colleges, et cetera, pushing different wellness techniques in order to extract more profit, to get us to work longer by taking care of our mental health, right? And the issue of hierarchy is really highlighted, and we'd like you to reflect on this throughout the presentation, highlighted by the fact that when we talk about student workers, we don't ever refer to them as co-workers. And not all workplaces are the same. I'm sure that there are some workplaces that refer to students or even to pages as co-workers, but largely in all of our experience and the experience of other folks that we've talked to, we never even consider them as a co-worker. They are a worker who also happens to work in the same place we are. And that language is very impactful. So corporate bureaucracy is also incredibly important to our study because libraries are increasingly being run as companies or corporations in order to maximize efficiency and extract profit from its employees. And this can be done through a variety of techniques, which you undoubtedly have experienced throughout your time working in the LIS field. So that can be restructuring, like we just talked about, retooling job descriptions, so adding more jobs while not increasing pay or not providing adequate training. This can also be a changing of the workspace. So think about not only a hierarchy in terms of social positions, but hierarchies physically in the workplace, the actual separation of workers, moving people outside of individual offices where they have more control and autonomy over their time and who gets access to them, and moving them to what's colloquially referred to as cube farms or large open floor plans, which it turns out was not great for the pandemic. And most importantly, in a corporate bureaucracy, in that hierarchy, the lowest workers in the institution are often impacted the most. The lowest workers, of course, being our student co-workers. Students are often, or are also very precarious. So precarious meaning that they're paid poorly, less than minimum wage, as we're discussing, in fact, and have unsecure jobs, often perform very mechanistic labor, so they don't have control or creativity in terms of the labor that they perform. And as seen in the pandemic, and most importantly, they have no access to sick time. In fact, laws in many cases have expressly forbidden them or stopped them from accruing this sick time and the ability to even get health insurance in some cases. So students are not only suffering a disproportionate labor to pay exchange, but they are paying with their actual health in many cases, which brings us to wellness. Oftentimes we're punished for not taking care of ourselves. Think of when people come into work sick and they're sent home for pay, and someone might not understand why they still came into work while they were sick and infected others. And that's because of the things that we discussed before, right? These are very important to keep in mind, especially as we were doing this study. So think about health tracking apps, which leads into our discussion of surveillance. Or in case of the pandemic, students usually staff front desks. It's more common at many institutions that students are now the front-facing folks in libraries, and they're being charged with the wellness of others. So that's policing mask usage in the front desk during the highest points in the pandemic. And many of these students are 18 years old, so they're already experiencing statistically the highest rates of depression in the United States. And that's the leading cause of disability. So they're put in positions that are not only unsafe to their physical health, but they're also hostile to their mental health as well. And these situations that they're being put in are just exacerbating both of those while still being asked to perform a lot of this labor. And of course, there's a lot of surveillance by managers, surveillance by these new health tracking apps, surveillance by the university. And then all of this, as we were discussing before, is just exacerbated under COVID-19. So what we were really getting at in our study is that we wanted to hear the individual voices of students as a reflection of the larger reproductions of systems of oppression. So COVID-19 has reflected this. And what's more, and I think what's very important, especially to the management aspect of this conference, is that there have been many studies that show library workers who are pages or students or some of those lowest people in the hierarchy are among the most diverse of all of our staff. And yet the higher up you go in terms of administration or responsibility, it gets more and more and more white. And we can ask ourselves why this is, but we know why this is if we're going to be discussing how we're treating pages and student workers. And we should be very deeply concerned about this. So the library profession loves to write endlessly about hiring and retaining diverse librarians, but then not even glance at this pool of amazing talent that we have in our students and in our paraprofessionals. Next slide. So we went over this just a minute ago, but this image on the right-hand side, we wanted to give you a little bit of an example of what we're talking about. So during, I believe this was towards the beginning of the pandemic or of the fall semester, I think it was September, right as school was starting. Career Services at ASU put out this advertisement that says Sync Days are the new sick days. So ASU Sync is the branded hybrid version that ASU transitioned to in order to keep students home primarily during the pandemic. So this says sick days no longer mean you miss class and fall behind. Log in from home and stay connected to class. They did have to remove this because there were a lot of complaints from students. Because what this is essentially saying is that it doesn't matter if you have COVID. It doesn't matter if we're in the middle of a pandemic. It doesn't matter if you're sick. You shouldn't be missing class. You can still be logging in and you can still be that productive body. And we think this is really important to talk about because language is important to talk about. Student workers are students first and foremost. And it is a privilege that we even get to have them in the library as much as we do. So not only is being a student a condition of their employment, but they are paying the university for an education as a priority. And a lot of the times outside of the workplace, depending on the professors they're having or the managers they're having, it's not always considered that they're under significant academic and economic stress on top of also working in the library. Next slide. So before we began our study, we went into a literature, or we reviewed some literature to see just how well represented student workers were and the student worker experience in a lot of academic publications. And so we found that school-age workers are disproportionately overrepresented in workplace injury statistics and more likely to experience harassment and bullying in the workplace. And anyone who's worked a front desk with students or with pages can absolutely attest to something like this. They often experience a lot more harassment either by patrons or even by managers or fellow workers. Senior colleagues often tend to delegate unpleasant or unsafe tasks to younger workers. And even though this was published in 2015, I think we can safely say that during the pandemic, this has absolutely happened with our student workers in terms of them being asked to police mask policies and come into work in the middle of a pandemic. Academic libraries are increasingly relying on the labor of undergraduate students while their financial compensation does not change. So this is unique for each institution. We talked about this in terms of Arizona State University and that we didn't even pay our students minimum wage until very recently. And then library student worker opinions were found by Jacobson and Schuyler that they were mixed on whether work contributes negatively to their stress and academic performance. So next slide. So we did find that there are quite a few gaps regarding discussion of non-academic student experiences. So there are plenty of articles talking about students' academic lives, but in all of those conversations is really missing their lives outside of that, and even their lives as workers, either in the library or off campus. And there are little to no representation of student voice or authorship, which we think is really reflective of a lot of the attitudes of students. So students as subjects of study rather than creators of information. And especially as librarians, where we teach information literacy, and if we're using the ACRL framework, we're talking a lot about authority and students being creators and producers. And yet we treat them very differently as coworkers. And we have to ask ourselves why. And what impact is this really having? So if we go to the next slide, Alexis is going to talk a little bit about some important dates about ASU, but again, we really hope that this presentation will also help everyone, like we have, reflect on our relationship with student workers, the language we use, and how we're treating them, and maybe how this is impacting their mental and physical health. Take it away, Alexis.
Yeah, definitely. So some of the dates that we've included they're just a little tidbit of what happened last year. Obviously, it was a very hectic year, but we included some dates that were of note. So March 16th, it's a year tomorrow, is when classes first transitioned to online for ASU. So that was when students were notified that classes would be going online. That was following spring break, and it was very sudden. Students received an email and were notified that they would not be coming back to class. At that time, student workers, it was hit or miss depending on the student worker and their supervisor. They would be notified, letting them know that they would either be returning to work or not returning to work. Most student workers were not meant to be returning to work at that time. So let's see, March 17th, teleworking was established. So that's when student workers were notified for sure that they would not be coming back. March 31st, all ASU libraries closed. So there was a 2-week gap between that time. April 12th, that's when we began our study. May 8th was the last day students were paid for the semester. May 15th was a phased approach for campus return. Until August 8th, the music library in Tempe opened. August 9th, Noble and Fletcher libraries opened. August 13th, Downtown and Polytechnic campus libraries opened. August 17th, all ASU libraries opened. August 18th was when our survey was released. Our survey was meant to collect data from student workers, asking them about their experiences during the pandemic, and we released that after all the libraries had reopened to gauge how student workers felt about their return to the library. Our survey was concluded September 9th, and then we began our interview process on October 8th. So we'll go into the study and what we found in our survey in the next section, and Andrew will be leading that section.
All right, thank you, Alexis. So a quick disclaimer about the nature of our study. Our results are not generalizable or representative of the entire population of student workers at academic libraries across the United States. Our sample size was very small. However, our methodology here was intended to permit us to investigate the affective response to such a prolific and traumatic event. So by the affect, I mean moods, feelings, and attitudes. And then through this investigation, we hope to reveal the emotions and meanings from the lived experience during the pandemic. And having some qualitative data from an early point in the pandemic could be useful for a more longitudinal or long-term analysis of, it's already been a lengthy outbreak. It's likely to continue into the future indefinitely. Okay, so we had 2 main motivations for taking part in this investigation. First, we hope to inform future discussions on emergency preparedness in academic libraries. So as we mentioned before, students are at the bottom of the organizational structure while they work in a front-facing capacity. So they're poised to analyze and reflect on the dissemination of emergency information and updates on library policy changes in a way that not all library staff are situated or prepared to be able to discuss and analyze. And second, academic libraries increasingly rely on the labor of student employees. Despite this, discussions of student workers aren't really found in library and information science literature. So we hope to shed some light on what it's like to be a college student working in a library during a period of global crisis. And we intend to elevate the voices of those working in a uniquely precarious labor environment. So we engaged in what's called phenomenological research. Phenomenology is an approach to qualitative research that focuses on the commonality of a lived experience within a particular group. So the fundamental goal of the phenomenological approach is to arrive at a description of the nature of the particular phenomenon. So here we want to find a description of the nature of working as a student at the academic library during a global pandemic. Our first phase was going through a literature review, which Ashley went through. Second phase, we collected data through an online survey and semi-structured interviews. And then we followed that up with some descriptive data analysis and reviewing descriptive data analysis on the interview transcripts. So the survey was sent out online. It was open for about a month. And the aim of the survey was to collect some qualitative data on the experience of student workers. We attempted to gauge how familiar student workers are with the labor laws that apply to them. We wanted to gauge their trust in their supervisors and their university. And we wanted to gauge how they feel about working at our library and how they feel about their future moving forward. For the interview, respondents to the survey had the option to indicate whether or not they'd like to be contacted for a follow-up semi-structured interview. Semi-structured interviews don't follow a formal list of questions. We start with about 5 questions and then let the conversation flow naturally. And Alexis was conducting these interviews. We were concerned about, because Ashley and I both supervise student workers, we wanted the responses in the interviews to be as open and honest as possible. So Alexis arranged the interviews and removed any identifying information, so that way any fears of retaliation would hopefully be removed from consideration. All right, and then, so that was a quick summary of what we did for the survey, and Alexis is going to talk about some of the results that we found. Actually, I talk about the results. Okay, so we have just some brief demographic information about our student workers here that participated in the survey. Most of them were domestic students. We had 1 international respondent. Most of our respondents were in-state students as well, and most of them resided off campus. We gauged how familiar they were with the minimum wage laws. This is self-reporting on how familiar they were. You'll see that fewer than 10% indicated that they were very familiar with the minimum wage legislation in Arizona, with most 50% saying that they're not familiar, and 37.5% saying that they were somewhat familiar. And again, this is self-reported. So we asked them, describe your familiarity with the law. We weren't quizzing them on the law. To gauge their sense of the precariousness of their job, we asked them how, if they felt any concern over their position or job security during the pandemic response. Almost half said that they felt some concern, or sorry, that they felt very concerned. Combined, it's nearly 80% of them felt some concern or very concerned. And you'll see, 14 and 7% down for not much concern or didn't feel concerned. So then we asked them to follow up too. We didn't just collect like yes or no answers. We had them provide some open-ended responses to the survey questions. And we included some of them here for you all to read about, their self-reported concern for their job security. One student wrote that my position is dependent on whether the university remains open to students. With campus under lockdown, the security of my position is threatened. And as we were discussing in the chat, our student workers did get paid for almost 2 months after our library closed for their regularly scheduled shifts. But once that May 8th date hit, they no longer received pay for any shifts that weren't worked, and students weren't working again through August. So there were several months of what was effectively a furlough at our libraries. Then some students expressed that they were concerned that the university might shut down again in the fall or in the spring, and then they would be without their job. This is their only means of income. And one student wrote that their biggest concern was not receiving PUA benefits, or pandemic unemployment assistance benefits, when the library had been closed during the pandemic response. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Arizona's process for applying for pandemic unemployment assistance was a little complicated. And just because you got denied 1 week doesn't mean you would get denied the next week. So you had to keep applying and would get back paid. It was a pretty stressful ordeal for student workers and anyone who was unemployed during this time. All right. And I'm just going to read this one to you because this one impacted us when we were reading it. It resonated with us. So the student wrote, when I first found out that the library was closing, it was a day before when we were going to shut down and I was on shift. I panicked initially and almost cried because I was scared I would not be able to pay for my bills. I'm thankful that ASU paid our regular wage during the regular school year, even though we were not working our shifts. It is something that not everyone was able to get. I was, however, going to continue living on campus and working at the library over the summer, and that is when the pay stopped and I was not able to do that. I had to find somewhere else to live and get another job. So life plans were changed, even if they're like short-term, temporary plans about where to live. And the job impacted more than just the like the financial health and the academic health of students. It definitely impacted their quality of life as well. And so as we mentioned earlier, we were investigating how student workers at academic libraries trust their supervisors and how they trust their institutions. Nearly everyone who responded indicated that they were satisfied with the communications from their supervisors. Everyone who responded to the survey indicated that they trust their supervisor. Almost everyone said that they got pandemic-related information from their supervisor. That's one of the difficulties of working in a large institution like Arizona State, is you get information from your workplace, from your direct supervisor, and from the institution itself. And then outside the scope of this study, there is some literature on the relationships between employees, direct supervisors, and their employing institutions. Generally speaking, workers and their direct supervisors have good relationships across workplace environments. However, workers tend to acknowledge that their supervisors lack the power to substantially alter conditions in the workplace. So while they might trust their supervisor and have good relationships with their supervisor, morale can still be low. Right, Alexis.
So to go off of that last question, which was asking students if they trusted their supervisor, where we got quite a bit of positive responses, all positive responses to that question. When we asked students if they trusted their institution, ASU, we got some mixed results. So 42.9% said no, and roughly 42.9% said yes, and then the other 14.3% preferred not to answer that question. So it was pretty evenly split. We got some mixed responses on that one, which was an interesting question to note. And that was kind of reflected in the interview that we ended up doing further on down the line. We'll see how that point is addressed. So next slide. So here's some of the feedback we got on trusting the institution, trusting ASU. So yes responses elaborated and said, I think ASU is doing its best to pay attention to the number of cases, and they'll do whatever needs to be done to protect the students and employees. Another student said, I trust them. Nothing seems to be hidden from us. I mostly trust ASU. I would say not completely, but for the most part, I do. Sometimes I believe they are run more like a money-making business than a place for students to grow. Overall, they take care of their students pretty well. The no response is elaborated. I think that they may put profit of the school before employees' health. This next one was interesting. Y'all just want to take our money and don't give a damn if we die because you don't care to enforce mask rules. The third one, opening the campus during a pandemic when health experts and doctors warned about outbreaks and increased cases says a lot about their priorities, especially since ASU has a very diverse student body in which many students come from outbreak areas or known hotspots. Then to have them return to campus where people do not always follow the guidelines is maddening. All right, so to go into the next slide, we did conduct an interview. Andrew, if you want, thank you. And so our survey was released August 18th, and our survey was concluded September 9th, and then a month after, we reached out to see if any study participants would like to be interviewed. 3 students indicated that they were interested in being interviewed, but only 1 responded to set up an interview. I was the student worker conducting the interview. We felt that it would be best that a student worker conduct the interview so that whoever was being interviewed felt comfortable. I tried to be as open about the process as possible when I was reaching out to students to make them feel comfortable and help them understand that this wasn't meant to punish them or their name would not be released to any of their supervisors. We wanted to make them feel comfortable. So so name and identifying characteristics of students were kept anonymous for student privacy. The interview was conducted by myself to encourage honesty and prevent possible intimidation. And as Andrew stated, we followed a semi-structured interview process, which meant that I had just a couple of questions I would ask the student, and the student was free to elaborate as they felt. And so some of the highlights from the interview are included in the next slide. It was a really fascinating interview. The student I interviewed was very honest and had a lot to say. Here are some of the quotes that I felt were really impactful from that interview. So the first one says, I think it has just brought to light like the differences between the students, the staff, and the administration and how disconnected some aspects of the teams are. And it's kind of disheartening. The next one, with the way that the power dynamics work, they are so much higher up than us that there's really no consequences to them if we are unhappy with their actions. And so even if we were able to submit complaints, there's really no motivation for them to actually care about us at all. The third one, most of us didn't come back because we wanted to come back and work in the library. We came back because this was the job we had and it would pay us. And then the last one, as sad as it sounds, we are expendable. We are just student workers and the library can function just fine without us. We are very aware of that, but it's not a good feeling and it doesn't make us really super excited and passionate. And this interview was very illuminating because the student that we interviewed felt strongly about their position within the library, and they spoke very highly of their coworkers in the library and their experience there, but they still had quite a lot to say in terms of their experience. And I think there was a lot of feelings of betrayal there, as can be seen in these little quotes. And so we asked the student what recommendations they had, and they had quite a bit of recommendations. They had a list, and they mentioned that they had brought that list to their supervisor so that the supervisor might keep that in mind for future situations. And so some of these recommendations were a student information database, such as Slack, where students can connect and answer questions. The student that we interviewed said that they don't always feel comfortable going to a supervisor, that there is this disconnect, that they don't often feel like the supervisor will answer any basic questions that the student has. And so students will often be going to one another to answer or ask these questions. And so they said if there was some way for them to do that easier, that would make it easier on them. Another recommendation was improvements to communications among supervisors and staff. And so that wasn't even communication between student worker and supervisor. That was just communication among supervisors and general full-time staff members. The student mentioned that when they did go to their supervisors, they felt like there was information missing when they were asking questions, and that left them mostly in the dark. And they said that they felt that that wasn't the fault of the supervisor at all, but that it was obviously a disconnect somewhere along the line. The third recommendation was motivation for staff to implement changes suggested by students. That one's pretty self-explanatory. They mentioned that even though staff was always very friendly, there was really nothing to encourage them to be kind to their student workers or reach out and talk to their student workers. They mentioned that they often felt like staff was protected in their desks back in the back, and that they didn't really have to interact with the front desk and the people coming into the library or with the student workers who were working these front desks. And then the final recommendation was more communication between people making rules and people enforcing those rules. And so as Andrew and Ashley both mentioned, student workers they're the first line of duty. They're the ones that have to work the front desk and have to be telling people to put their masks on during COVID, and have to be going around and checking to make sure people are wearing masks. And the student worker felt that even though they understood that this job had to be done, they didn't feel like they were being protected in that position. And they felt as though if they were in a position where they had to go out to a supervisor and tell them about a difficult situation, that the supervisor would likely take the side of the patron instead of stopping to defend the student worker. And so that was just some of the recommendations we got from that interview. All right, so this next section is our conclusions, and we're just incorporating some of these recommendations that we got from the interview as well as from the survey. The survey had a lot of great quotes, as we read earlier. And so some of these recommendations include policies, so involving students in decision-making and making decisions on the behalf of students, but keeping students in the loop when that needs to be done. And so actually recently, I think if Andrew or Ashley want to speak to this a little more, but student supervisors at ASU successfully advocated for an annual student raise. And so now I understand that supervisors are able to give students raises based off of how much time they've spent with the library. And that was due to student supervisors getting together and advocating for students on their behalf. Do you want to add to that at all, Andrew?
Yeah, the student supervisors got together and advocated for some more like formal raise policies, advocating for students. A lot of concern was expressed from the students, and it's not just coming from Ashley and I. There's a culture here where the student supervisors are very concerned about their student workers, and that's definitely we're seeing more and more of that as we continue to move forward through the pandemic response. So it's a small win. It seems like a small win, but it's really impactful for those who are getting that pay raise.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so one of the other recommendations we got was to publish studies in collaboration with students, allow student voices to be heard. Next, educate, so talk with students about labor laws and benefits. As we saw, I was a little shocked by those numbers, but not surprised, I suppose, that students, a large part of our student worker population didn't really feel comfortable with what they knew about labor laws. They didn't feel like they could defend any of that information, and that was sort of reflected in our survey and in our interview as well. So maybe just talking with students, asking them how much they know about minimum wage laws, how much they know about what they're getting paid. So next is advocating, so pushing for better pay and working conditions in your students. Even if you do feel like your student workers are being respected and valued in your workplace, by you and your coworkers, if you refer to student workers as your coworkers, I think that's wonderful and I think that's amazing. But I think going into our next point, just acknowledging that just because you might value and respect these student workers doesn't mean that your institution necessarily does. Students have complex lives and experiences. You have to keep that in mind when you are thinking about student workers. These aren't just your coworkers, these are your coworkers and their students. They have a lot on their plate. And that might not be something that is always kept in mind by the greater institution. And so our final recommendation was to motivate, so to encourage staff to listen to student recommendations, just to talk to students, to make them a part of the team, make them feel like their voices are being heard. Because as we saw from that interview, it was a little heartbreaking. Students really love their workplaces, but they don't feel like they are being heard, or like their voice makes a difference. It's just a job, and they don't feel like they're getting that same support that they're giving their library. And so these are some of our recommendations. Our references are on the next slide, as well as some suggested readings. And then our last slide. Thank you very much for listening to our presentation. If anybody has any questions, we can address them now. I know the chat has been really going, which we really appreciate.
And thank you so much for that presentation, Andrew, Alexis, and Michelle. So now we'll go ahead and take some questions. You can put your questions into the Q&A or into the chat. Would you prefer to read the questions from the Q&A?
Sure, yeah. I see we have one in there right now. How big is Arizona State University, and how many students approximately does it employ each year? ASU is massive. I think we have over 100,000 students in person and online, continuing to expand. And the library employs over 200 student workers at the moment.
Thank you. And so the next question in the Q&A was, have you taken these results to your library's administration? And if so, what has been their reaction?
Hey, Ashley, you want to touch on this one?
Yeah, so some of these questions are a little complicated and require some finessing, as I'm sure you'll all understand. But we did speak with, so we did take these findings to the Arizona Library Association, and it was also brought up at their annual conference. And from there was a lot of discussion with not only librarians and staff around the state of Arizona, but also one of our associate university librarians was contacted about it too. And it didn't actually go anywhere. I don't have much more information about it, but they were aware of our study. And we did speak to the associate librarians about it, but there was almost no reaction other than, I guess, I would say it could have had an impact in terms of those negotiations that happened for an increase in student pay, but we can't really be sure what the impacts were because we didn't see anything tangible necessarily come out of it. Do you have anything to add to that, Andrew?
Yeah, so while library administration, we haven't had any direct conversations with library administration. We have had conversations with middle management and those who oversee the supervision of the buildings and the managers across ASU campuses. And these discussions have been like largely productive in the sense that like we're hoping to implement some of this moving forward. And streamline some things like raises and training and communication channels, not only at individual branches, but across the entire library network at Arizona State.
And as Andrew mentioned earlier, a lot of our supervisors are incredibly excellent people. So I think that this work was probably going to be done regardless of whether or not we had done the study or given the presentation. But in an environment in a university that really values data-driven decision-making, I don't think that this hurt. I think that having the numbers and having this solid evidence is just more of an incentive for when those managers and supervisors speak up to be heard by administration when some of the bigger decisions need to be made.
All right, another one in the chat. I think I saw this in the chat at some point. What are y'all considering but are we considering a follow-up study survey interview for the fall or for this spring? At the moment, Alexis, you want to chime in?
No, I mean, I'm assuming we're going to say the same thing. So you're welcome to take over, but we do not have any plans for future studies, to my understanding. At least that's not something that we had discussed, but we all agreed that we felt like this was an important topic of conversation, and we feel like there will continue to be studies done on the student worker experience and student workers, and we feel like that should be a topic that is discussed in further studies, but maybe not focusing on the pandemic aspect of that. Maybe we can revisit this in another way in the future.
Yep.
Did you want to add anything, Andrew?
No, I think that's good. Yeah, never off the table, but currently no solid plans yet. Next question. What are some suggestions on ways to integrate student workers to become creators of content and engage in more creative tasks with librarians and library staff? Alexis, do you want to speak to how you got involved in this project?
Yeah, so Ashley was actually my supervisor when I was a student worker, and Ashley reached out to me and asked if Ashley and Andrew both reached out to me and asked if I would be interested in helping with a study. And I said yes, because they're wonderful coworkers and they've always been very welcoming and open to any suggestions I've had in the workplace, which I think was very important. Just knowing that I would be working with people that I trusted and enjoyed spending time with. And so I would say, just asking students if they want to be involved in projects, any projects. I'm sure they'd be more than willing to help. But maybe just creating that like rapport between students in the library, so that you can build that trust, and asking them about their day and treating them like you would a coworker. Maybe helping them with some of their work. That would be really helpful. I'm sure. I'm sure they don't need help, obviously, but I think that really is representative of a lot for students. Is just knowing that there's an interest there from their supervisors, and then they're more likely to help you with anything you might need. For sure. If you guys would like to add anything as well.
If you give students the opportunity to be creative at work, and ask for their input, right, especially in a place where the culture is not necessarily established, where student workers are going to advance ideas for projects or just things to improve the workplace, asking over and over again, like throughout the years, and then implementing some of the ideas that you think could actually be beneficial, I think could slowly like build a culture where students feel more engaged and more comfortable speaking up to share ideas for things, as a more permanent staff member might.
Yeah, I think Andrew and Alexis said some really amazing things. And I know that it's very easy to ask for solutions and say, oh, well, what are some like programs we could implement, or A, B, and C, some tangible things that we can do to fix this issue. But this question is hard to answer because it is going to depend on the institution and the environment, the students, the coworkers, et cetera, et cetera. But the most important thing about what Andrew and Alexis said, at least to me, is that none of this work can be done if you don't already establish like a rapport and a culture with your students. If you don't tell them hello every day and ask how their day is and actually show interest in them as people first, then I'm not sure that people will get very far. I think you won't have to ask students to engage if you already have an environment, or if you're working on an environment where they feel comfortable to speak up. I think they will offer their suggestions and be excited to work next to us if that environment is created. And that, as someone in a position of power, is our responsibility. And it has to be very, very intentional. And there are no easy one-fit solutions to this if that doesn't exist. So I can read the next question, unless either of you had anything else to add. I'm new to managing student employees. In your opinion, from each of you, what would be your top tip for managing a student?
Well, I have not had to manage any students, so if y'all would like to take this one, I can just speak as a former student, but we can go to me at the end.
I think it's important to acknowledge that they're students first. That when it comes to at least the academic calendar at this university, when students are going to need breaks or take time off is largely predictable. And so if we go to learn to expect that around finals or around midterms, large labs, things like that, that students are going to need to be absent to work on these projects, I think that it poses less of an inconvenience if you build that into your scheduling and planning, as well as understanding that, right, they're students first. They can only have this job by being a student. Trying to make this one less stressful thing in their life as it is, and just coming from that position of empathy and concern, I think is the most important in my experience, at least, or when it comes to my management style, I guess you would say.
Yeah, Andrew brings up with a point about management style. This question is also a little difficult to ask because theory is theory, management theory is management theory, and every single person is going to practice this very differently depending on who you are and your personality and also your own lived experiences in your institution. You might be pressured to do something from your supervisors that you might not otherwise want to do. But keeping that in mind, I think that there is a lot of ground to be able to be very respectful of students' lived experiences and be gentle. So this answer is coming from my personal praxis of management, and I tend towards less structured and more affective type of management styles. So, and this actually goes along with the next question that we have in the Q&A, which is keeping in mind that student employees have lives outside of work. I still expect them to arrive on time and be dependable. I have one student who uses life issues to explain bad behavior. How do you handle that balance? So these two questions I think are related, which is that I talk to my students, and of course, people might have issues not showing up to work on time, not doing things. And I always remind myself at the end of the day, what is the benefit versus the detriment? Is punishing or having punitive measures for student workers who we know are stressed, who we know have difficult lives, and who it might seem like they're coming up with excuses? Maybe there's something else that's there, and is punishing them worth the mental and physical sacrifices that are going to be made? And at the end of the day, yeah, we do have to staff our front desks, and then we also have to consider, why is it that it is so stressful to staff front desks when students will inevitably call out sick or maybe have certain behaviors? Maybe the issue is us and our institutions, and maybe that is something that we can start advocating for and changing and working with administration, rather than having that all roll downhill onto students who are usually 18 years old. They're going to have things going on that are very understandable in their lives. And even if it might seem like a minor issue or a bad behavior to us, making that space as a supervisor where they feel comfortable to actually be very honest with you and tell you what's going on, that underlying issue rather than like workplace behavior, I think is really crucial. But again, that's my personal practice that might not work for everybody.
So we have one last question. We have 1 minute left. I'm going to try and tackle it super fast. Do you have any tips for creating equity across student positions? At my institution, the pay rate varies greatly depending on department and unit, not tied to experience, which has been an issue for student morale. One thing we've done at ASU, and this wasn't anything that we initiated, but we started a meeting with all the supervisors across departments, across all campuses, to talk about issues and information that's necessary for to keep our libraries functioning. One of our tips or one of the recommendations that students had was to create a better information playing field, so the dissemination of information would be more fair and more even, more open and transparent. And by doing that, that's how we learned about the different scheduled pay raises built in.
Okay.
But I'm getting told that I have to shut this down. So feel free to email us. Our contact information was on the first slide, and this is being recorded. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you all for your time.
And thank you all for joining us during the session today. We really appreciate it.